There is a drug in your tonic water, not a metaphor, not a stretch. An actual pharmaceutical compound, one that was used for centuries to treat a disease that killed millions, and it is sitting right now in the bottle on your shelf or the glass on your table mixed with gin because somewhere along the line someone decided that was fine. That compound is quinine, and the story of how a malaria drug ended up in a cocktail mixer sold in every supermarket on Earth, consumed by hundreds of millions of people who have no idea what they're actually drinking, is not an accident. It is a century of decisions, corporate decisions, regulatory decisions, and one very specific decision made by beverage companies who figured out that if you make something bitter enough, people will convince themselves it is medicine. Let's go back to where quinine actually comes from, because this part most people genuinely do not know. The cinchona tree, native to the eastern slopes of the Andes in South America. Indigenous communities had been using the bark of this tree for generations, not for taste, not for recreation, but because it worked against fever. When European colonizers arrived in South America in the 1600s, they eventually extracted the active compound from that bark, quinine. And what they found was that quinine had a specific, measurable pharmacological effect on the parasite that causes malaria. It interfered with the parasite's ability to digest hemoglobin inside red blood cells, essentially poisoning the parasite from the inside out. This was not a folk remedy, this was a functional drug. For roughly 3 centuries, quinine was the primary treatment for malaria across the entire world. Entire colonial military campaigns depended on access to it. The British Empire supplied its soldiers and administrators in India and Africa with quinine dissolved in carbonated water to make the bitterness tolerable. They added gin, they added sugar. That combination, that specific colonial field medicine, is where the gin and tonic comes from. Not a cocktail, a survival drink, with a pharmaceutical compound as its core ingredient. Now here is where the story gets strange, because quinine never left. Modern anti-malarial drugs replaced it in clinical medicine, more effective compounds, fewer side effects, better tolerability. But quinine stayed in the beverages, and it stayed not because it was doing anything measurable for the people drinking it in those concentrations, but because the flavor worked. Because beverage companies discovered that a specific level of bitterness, when combined with carbonation and sweetness, produced something that people experienced as refreshing in a way that was almost impossible to replicate without it. And so the question of whether quinine was doing anything useful to the body became almost irrelevant. It was doing something useful to the product. If you enjoy understanding how the world actually works beneath the surface, subscribe. It is the best way to support this work. Drop in the comments what city or country you're watching from. This script is deeply researched using data from the United States Food and Drug Administration's official regulatory database and published research from the journal Clinical Pharmacology and Therapeutics. Now back to it. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, currently limits quinine in commercially sold tonic water to 83 parts per million. To put that in a frame that actually means something, a therapeutic dose of quinine used to treat malaria is somewhere between 500 and 1,000 milligrams. A standard glass of tonic water contains somewhere around 83 milligrams per liter. So you're not getting a therapeutic dose. You're getting a subtherapeutic dose of a drug in a soft drink. And that distinction matters more than most people realize, because subtherapeutic doses of pharmaceutical compounds do not work the way full doses do. A full dose of quinine suppresses a malaria parasite. A subtherapeutic dose of quinine does essentially nothing to a malaria parasite, but it still does something to the human body. It still enters the bloodstream. It still interacts with biological systems, just not at the level where anyone is measuring the outcomes and calling it medicine. The FDA explicitly removed quinine from over-the-counter sale as a standalone drug in 2007. The reason? Reports of serious adverse effects, including a condition called thrombocytopenia, a dangerous drop in platelet count that can cause uncontrolled bleeding. People were buying quinine supplements to treat leg cramps, a use the FDA had never approved, and some of them were experiencing life-threatening reactions. The agency pulled it, said clearly, this compound has a narrow therapeutic window, meaning the gap between a useful dose and a harmful dose is small, and it should not be available without a prescription. That happened in 2007. Tonic water continued selling on every shelf in every supermarket on the planet, with quinine in it, because the regulatory category is beverage, not drug, and the concentration is below the threshold that requires a prescription. The same compound, 2 different regulatory categories. One gets pulled from shelves for safety reasons, the other gets mixed with citrus flavoring and sold next to the sparkling water. And here is where the people actually paying attention start to feel the weight of that. Because the FDA's position is not that quinine is safe at subtherapeutic doses for all people. Their position is that it is safe at those doses for most people under normal circumstances. That language, most people, normal circumstances, is doing a lot of work. Quinine at the concentrations in tonic water has documented interactions with a specific class of drugs called antiarrhythmics, medications used to regulate heart rhythm. It has documented interactions with blood thinners. It has documented interactions with certain antibiotics. And it carries a specific risk for people with a genetic condition called G6PD deficiency, glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase deficiency, which affects an estimated 400 million people worldwide. In people with this condition, quinine can trigger a breakdown of red blood cells called hemolytic anemia. 400 million people. That is more than the entire population of the United States. And most of them do not know they have this condition because in many parts of the world it is never tested for. That is not hypothetical. That is documented pharmacology, written in medical literature, not on the tonic water label. So now you have the picture. A pharmaceutical compound with a narrow safety window, documented drug interactions, and a known risk for a genetic condition affecting hundreds of millions of people. Sold as a mixer, marketed as a lifestyle product, with a label that lists quinine as an ingredient in small print and explains none of the above. But there is another layer here, because the modern tonic water industry did not simply preserve quinine. It rebuilt the product around a specific kind of health signaling that was never earned. Go look at the premium tonic water market right now. The brands at the high end, not the budget supermarket versions, but the ones in the small glass bottles, the ones in the cocktail bars, the ones positioned next to artisanal spirits. They market quinine content almost as a selling point. Contains natural quinine, as if natural quinine is a wellness ingredient, as if the cinchona bark origin story transforms a subtherapeutic dose of a restricted pharmaceutical compound into something you should seek out. The wellness framing around tonic water is almost entirely manufactured. You will find claims online and occasionally on packaging that quinine aids digestion, that it has anti-inflammatory properties, that it supports sleep and relieves leg cramps. Some of these claims have a basis in older medical literature at therapeutic doses. At the doses in tonic water, none of them are supported by controlled clinical evidence. The FDA position, again, is that quinine should not be used to treat leg cramps at all, at any dose available over the counter, because the risk-to-benefit ratio does not support it. But the claims persist, because they are not being made by pharmaceutical companies, where they would require clinical substantiation. They are being made by beverage companies, in marketing copy and blog posts, in the cultural narrative around the product. And cultural narratives do not require FDA approval. Now, let's look at what else is actually in tonic water. Because quinine is the compound with the history and the pharmacology, but it is not the only thing in the glass. Standard commercial tonic water contains carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup or sugar, often in amounts comparable to a standard soda, citric acid, natural flavors, and sodium benzoate as a preservative. The sugar content alone is something most people systematically underestimate. A standard 250 milliliter serving of major commercial tonic water contains roughly 22 to 25 grams of sugar. That is approaching the sugar content of a can of cola. And tonic water is not culturally categorized as a sugary drink. It is categorized as a mixer, as something vaguely medicinal, as the lighter option at the bar. It is none of those things, nutritionally speaking. The diet, or slimline versions, replace sugar with artificial sweeteners, typically aspartame or saccharin, which brings its own layer of ongoing scientific debate that the label also does not summarize for you. The carbonation can contribute to bloating and gas in people with sensitivities. The sodium benzoate, when combined with vitamin C, citric acid is a form of that, can produce trace amounts of benzene, a known carcinogen. At the concentrations found in drinks, regulatory agencies consider this acceptable. Acceptable is not the same as zero risk. It is a calculation about thresholds and populations and tolerable exposure levels, a calculation made by regulators, not communicated to consumers. The gin and tonic specifically trades on the pharmacological history of quinine without delivering any of its pharmacological function. The bitterness is real. The quinine is real. The malaria protection is not there. The digestion benefit is not documented at this dose. The leg cramp relief is not approved. What is left is a flavor experience that feels medicinal because it shares a compound with something that once was medicine. And that feeling, that specific embodied sense that what you are consuming is doing something, is worth billions of dollars a year to the companies that sell it. The global tonic water market was valued at approximately $2.8 billion in 2023. It is projected to exceed $4 billion by 2030. That growth is driven almost entirely by the premium and craft segment, the small bottle, high quinine, heritage branding end of the market. the segment that is most explicitly monetizing the pharmaceutical history of a compound that the FDA removed from over-the-counter drug sale because it was too risky to sell as a drug. That is the mechanism. That is the machine. A compound restricted in drug form gets repackaged in beverage form. The restriction stays invisible. The heritage story stays visible. The wellness associations stay in the cultural air around the product. And the people drinking it, most of them, are not making an informed choice about a pharmaceutical compound. They are making a flavor choice, a lifestyle choice, a cocktail choice, with no information about what is actually in the glass. There is one more thing you need to know, and this is the part that does not make it onto any label anywhere. Quinine is fluorescent. Under ultraviolet light, tonic water glows a vivid blue-white. This is a direct result of the quinine molecule's structure. It absorbs ultraviolet light and re-emits it in the visible spectrum. This physical property has nothing to do with health or harm. It is just what the molecule does. But it has been used for decades in chemistry classrooms around the world as a demonstration of fluorescence, because tonic water is cheap and the effect is dramatic and immediate. The reason this matters is not the fluorescence itself. It is what the fluorescence tells you. A compound visible enough under UV light to light up a glass is a compound with a real, specific, measurable molecular structure interacting with energy in a way you can see. This is not water. This is not sugar water with bubbles. This is a pharmacologically active molecule sitting in your mixer, glowing under the right light, doing things that most people never think to ask about. And the beverage companies know exactly what they have. They have always known. The craft tonic revival of the last 15 years did not happen because consumers suddenly discovered quinine. It happened because marketers rediscovered the story of quinine, the Andes, the colonizers, the soldiers in India, the malaria treatment, the cinchona bark, and realized that story was sitting in their product, unused, and that it was worth more than anything they had been selling. The premium tonic water you pay 3 times as much for in the glass bottle with the vintage label is priced on a story about a pharmaceutical compound with a complicated safety history, being sold at subtherapeutic doses as a lifestyle ingredient by companies operating in a regulatory gap between the drug category and the beverage category. A gap that exists not because regulators missed it, but because the concentration is low enough, and the history is old enough, and the cultural category is established enough that changing it would require a fight no one has chosen to pick. The tonic water is in your glass. The quinine is in the tonic water. The FDA pulled that compound from drug shelves 17 years ago for safety reasons. The beverage shelf is 8 feet away. If this changed how you see something you thought you already understood, subscribe. Every video goes this deep. We will see you in the next one. And that gap has a name in regulatory language. It is called the Generally Recognized as Safe designation, GRAS. A category that allows compounds with a long history of use in food and beverage products to remain on shelves without the clinical trial burden required for new drug approvals. Quinine earned its GRAS status not through modern safety testing, but through historical precedent. It was in the drinks before the modern regulatory framework existed, and so it stayed. That is not a conspiracy. That is how legacy compounds work inside regulatory systems that were built after the products were already embedded in culture. The system is not designed to go back. It is designed to evaluate what is new. Quinine is not new. Quinine is old enough that the regulatory machinery essentially stepped around it and kept moving. But here's what that means for you. Specifically, drinking it today. The safety data that underpins the GRAS designation for quinine in beverages is largely based on consumption patterns from decades ago, when tonic water was consumed less frequently, in smaller quantities, by a population that was not simultaneously taking the range of medications that are now common across the developed world. The drug interaction risk was lower then, not because quinine was different, because the population consuming it was on fewer drugs. Today, a significant portion of adults in high-income countries take some form of daily medication. Statins for cholesterol, blood pressure medications, antidepressants, blood thinners, antiarrhythmics, and the interaction profiles between quinine and several of these drug classes are documented and real. The question of whether 83 milligrams per liter is safe was not answered with those people in mind. It was answered with a different population, in a different era, with a different baseline of pharmaceutical consumption. Nobody has gone back and asked the question again with updated data, not because the answer would necessarily be alarming, but because nobody is required to. The designation stands, the product sells, the population taking daily medications drinks it at cocktail bars and does not think about it because there's nothing on the label instructing them to. Now think about the marketing direction the industry chose when craft tonic water began its rise, because the timing is specific and it is not coincidental. The craft spirits movement accelerated in the early 2000s. Gin specifically underwent a global revival, with hundreds of new distilleries opening across Europe, North America, and eventually Asia and South America. Gin needed a mixer, and premium gin needed a premium mixer. The tonic water industry responded not by reformulating the product for better safety transparency, but by leaning harder into the historical and botanical identity of quinine. The cinchona bark imagery went onto labels. The word natural went next to quinine in ingredient lists. Small bottle formats at high price points communicated quality and intentionality. The pharmacological past of the ingredient became the aesthetic of the product. Fever Tree, the British company that now dominates the premium tonic water segment globally, built its entire brand identity around the cinchona bark story. The name itself references the fever tree, one of the common names for the cinchona plant. The company's founding narrative centers on the quality and sourcing of its quinine. And that narrative worked so effectively that the company went public on the London Stock Exchange in 2014 and reached a valuation of over £2 billion within 4 years. £2 billion. Built on the marketing of a sub-therapeutic dose of a compound the FDA pulled from drug shelves. Built on a story about malaria medicine in the Andes. Built on a cultural association between bitterness and benefit that was never supported by clinical evidence at these concentrations, but was supported by centuries of embodied human belief that if something tastes like medicine, it is probably doing something. That belief is pharmacologically called the bitter taste receptor response. Bitter compounds activate specific receptors, T2R receptors, distributed not just on the tongue, but throughout the gastrointestinal tract, and even in certain immune and respiratory tissues. The activation of these receptors does produce real physiological responses: increased saliva production, increased gastric acid secretion, changes in gut motility. These responses are real, they are measurable, and they happen with quinine specifically because quinine is one of the most potent bitter compounds that humans regularly consume. So when someone drinks tonic water and feels like it is doing something, they are not entirely wrong. Something is happening. Bitter receptors are firing, digestive responses are being triggered. The body is responding to a real compound in a real way. The problem is that none of those responses constitute the therapeutic actions being implied by the marketing, and none of them are unique to quinine. Any sufficiently bitter compound would do the same. The quinine story is being carried by a biological response that does not require quinine to explain it. That is the final layer of the machine. The product works just enough, in a real enough way, through a mechanism real enough to feel genuine, that the gap between what it is and what it is assumed to be stays invisible. Nobody feels nothing when they drink it, so nobody asks what exactly they are feeling.